I was so focused on being healed, permanently healed, and having my heart restored to where it was and having my life back. And I was just waiting for that miracle that I had envisioned for myself. And I didn't realize that whole time that I was living in it. I was living in the miracle, and that there were these little tiny flecks of glitter swirling all around me. But I was so focused on something outside of it, I couldn't see.
Hello, and welcome to Grief, Gratitude, and the Gray in Between podcast. This podcast is about exploring the grief that occurs at different times in our lives, in which we have had major changes and transitions that literally shake us to the core and make us experience grief. I created this podcast for people to feel a little less hopeless and alone in their own grief process as they hear the stories of others who have had similar journeys. I'm Kendra Rinaldi, your host. Now, let's dive right into today's episode. Today we are joined by award-winning writer Lorianne Wood. Lorianne's journey through a serious heart condition has inspired her to write and speak about deep faith questions. And one of her books really dives into that. It's titled Divine Detour. The path you'd never choose can lead to the faith you've always wanted. Her work has been featured in numerous publications, including Bella Grace magazine and the New York Times. And I am very excited to talk to her, particularly because one of the chapters in her Divine Detour book is actually titled Grief and Gratitude. Is that correct? Yes? Was that
Yeah.
right? So it's like perfect for our conversation. So welcome, Lorianne.
Thank you, Kendra. It's great to be here. I'm excited to have this conversation.
I am happy you are here and happy to be talking about this. It's going to be particularly about the grief that we can have by experiencing a near death experience and how life just completely changes. So, talk to us a little bit of what your life looked like prior to November 2015. What
Mm,
was your life before that?
yes. I was just cruising along. I was in great health. I've always been in really good health, always had low blood pressure, low cholesterol, took care of myself. I knew I needed to start exercising more, but I was really careful about what I ate. And I always got good reports from the doctor. So I was, I had kids at home still. I had some in college, but I was just kind of cruising along, expecting just to be doing what I was doing, which at that time was teaching college. And I just expected to keep doing that. And then I got this unexpected thing dropped in my lap, and everything changed.
What were the symptoms that you were experiencing at them, and how, if you don't mind sharing this, because you say you had some kids in college. How many kids do you have by the way?
I have three.
3 kids. So you still had 1 at home and 2 in
Yes.
college at that moment. So you're young. You were probably what, in your early 50s max at that moment?
I was 51.
Yeah.
Hmm.
So here you are. So then what were some of the things you started to feel, or what happened in that November? You said November 6th was one date that you mentioned
Hmm.
that, and
Hmm.
then so tell us what happened.
Yeah. So it sort of complicated it because right before my diagnosis, I actually had a medical evaluation for a life insurance policy. And they said, your numbers are so great. You're in such good health that you have less than 3% chance of ever developing heart disease in your lifetime. And I thought, well, I wasn't surprised by that. I've always been, had on my radar cancer, and especially breast cancer and other things like that that ran in my family. But at that time, I thought if I took care of myself the way I knew I should, that I could completely avoid heart disease. And so 3 weeks later, I just wasn't feeling very well. It was Thanksgiving week, and things were happening, and the kids were coming back home, and I didn't have the energy I needed to have, and I knew something was up, and so I kind of suffered through that week. Went to convenient care a couple times and ended up finally on Friday after Thanksgiving going to my family doctor because I had to spend the entire Thanksgiving day in bed, which was really unlike me. I could hear all the things going on. They had Thanksgiving dinner and I could hear it and I heard them talking and laughing, but I just couldn't I didn't have the energy and the muscles to get out of bed. And I thought, honestly, I thought I have pneumonia. I've never had it, but I bet that's what I have. And so I went to the doctor and he immediately found that I had an extremely enlarged heart and that it was functioning at only 6%. And so I thought, well, that came out of nowhere. But in reality, I did have symptoms for many years that I just didn't think were heart related. I just thought they were age related or some other situation going on, but I had no idea they were heart related.
Wow. So now what kind of tests had they done for your life insurance that in that moment, like your markers then of your
Mhm.
heart were
Yeah.
fine, yet it's something that you yourself felt you've had symptoms of maybe exhaustion or just not being able to like what are they missing? Now I'm glad you were able to
Right.
get your your life
Preferred.
insurance because
Yeah.
the thing is that a lot of times people are negated because of things like this, right? That are pre-existing conditions and then they're not able to get this type of insurance. So
Sure.
what kind of tests then can someone do in order to really know what their
Mhm.
health status
Yeah.
is?
I think my best advice to tell someone is if you know something's not right with you, ask your doctor because this medical evaluation I had, they took my blood pressure, which has always been great. And they took a blood sample and they didn't see anything in that. And so they did all the standard tests, but they didn't know that I couldn't do inclines. They didn't know that I was short of breath walking. They didn't test any of that. And the test that my doctor ended up doing that Friday was just they call it an echocardiogram, but it's basically just a sonogram like you have when you're pregnant of your heart. And they can look at the structure of your heart. And mine was I have a lot of things going on with the electrical system in my heart. And they don't know if I was born with it and just compensated all this time, or if I got a virus and it changed that electrical system. So I would say it is scary, right? Because you think you're doing all the right things, but what I wasn't doing right was I wasn't sharing with my doctor about that I couldn't really do inclines. We were at the Grand Canyon and I about didn't get out of the Grand Canyon. I was great going down, but coming back up, by the time I got up, my whole body was shaking and I thought, I'm so out of shape. This is embarrassing. But it should have been more of a red flag that I shared with my doctor.
It's sometimes not just what you like, you don't even know what to say sometimes at the doctor, like you're saying. You're like, "Oh, maybe I just need to exercise more." It's really, are you being asked the right questions, right?
Yes.
It's really that. It's we gotta change the system. We went to a wellness check for my kids, and the doctor was even asking my son, like, "How are you feeling emotionally?" He's 17. Emotionally, uh, depression, anxiety. We're a whole being, right? We're not
Mhm.
just one little thing. And sometimes we just focus on these little narrow areas instead of really asking a well rounded question for an individual to really be able to see, okay, that doesn't sound about, right, Lorianne. You should be able to go up a hill if you came down it, and not be feeling like you're about to pass out. 'Cause
Yes, yes. And I think too, what you brought up a good point about they need to ask the right questions. Doctor's visits are so fast now. You wait and you wait, and they come in, and you're thinking, okay, what are the most important things? I'm going to hit the high points because they're going to walk out of here. And so you hit, the main things that you came in for, and all those little things that are sort of nagging at the back of your mind, like, I don't know, I can't really exercise like I used to. And that stuff gets pushed under the rug. So what I've started doing is really taking advantage of this online, when you can send your doctor a question and just say, visit follow up question. Oh, I forgot to mention that I'm a little bit short of breath when I do this, and I've noticed it's getting worse. And it feels like it's number one, not as embarrassing. You're not looking right at them. And number two, you feel like you have a little bit more time and it's documented. So if you can do that and you have access to be able to do that online, I think that's a pretty good option.
Now in those days, and that's a great tip. And also because you don't wanna sound like a hypochondriac every time you go to a doctor, right? And like with this list of like a notebook filled with all the notes, it's like,
Yes.
how I feel nowadays. I'm like, "My nails are brittle, my this," of course, in this midlife age space that I'm in of like, "Oh, this is not like how I used to be a few years back." No, uh, now in these moments and in that moment of being really faced with the possibility of death, what was coming through your mind? And I know you are a faith-based individual. You have that's been one of your cornerstones to be able to kind of hold you through this space, and I'll dive into that in a minute. But what what were your thoughts in that moment as a mother, as a wife? Like, what was going on
Mhm.
in that moment of that facing possibility of death?
Yes. I think I can look back on it now and think I was in one of the stages of grief. I was in denial for a long time because I was thinking, I'm going to leave the hospital, I'm going to get well, and things are going to be back to the way they were. Even though I had people coming in, I had nurses and doctors coming in tears saying, I'm about to pull the rug out from under you. I'm sorry. And I wasn't hearing it. I was hearing it, but I wasn't taking it in because in my mind, I'm like, no, you don't get it. I'm healthy. You don't know me. I'm going to be fine. And I kind of stayed in that space and really just researched and tried to find, because it's kind of embarrassing to admit, but at that point in my life, I thought there were two kinds of illnesses. There was like an acute illness that was treatable, that you went to the doctor and they either set your broken arm or they gave you an antibiotic and you got over it. Or there was something terminal that they couldn't help you with, and you were on this short timeline, and unfortunately, you weren't going to survive. I didn't know there was this thing called chronic illness that just becomes part of who you are, and it just becomes part of your life. And I didn't know that I was at the very beginning of what's now been 9 years, thankfully, of this chronic illness. Now, mine is chronic and it's progressive also, which means it gets worse over time, but it also never goes away. And, they manage it well with medications and devices and surgeries, but it's just something you live with every day. And it changes not only what you do, it changes your mindset. It changes kind of how you experience life.
Because that whole journey that at the beginning, was it, like, about what, 16 did you write, like, 16 months or so of, like, full on almost being at the were you at the hospital for those 16 months continuously, or
No,
just in and out, in and out, in and out?
it was, I got diagnosed. I was in ICU for 2 weeks. And then they finally let me go home with a life vest, which is like an external defibrillator vest.
Mhm.
And I was flown to Cleveland Clinic and I was treated as her most critical patient, but she let me come back home. But now, she wrote the foreword to the book and she can tell you, you can learn more about her thoughts, which she didn't share all, all of them with me at the time. But she didn't think that I'd be coming back. Once I flew home to Arkansas, she thought, well, I'll never see her again because I was just in such bad shape. And she told me that my heart was the largest heart she'd ever seen.
Wow.
it kind of sunk in that that's not good when you're talking about the director of transplant at Cleveland
Mm.
Clinic, and this is something bigger than what I thought it was. So I eventually got to take that defibrillator vest off, and I got an internal defibrillator and pacemaker, and I'm on a lot of medications, but that heart failure is true to form. I'm managing it really well, and thankful, so thankful for all the medical care I have. But it my function is going down, and it kind of plateaus sometimes, and then it'll take another little dip. And so we kind of just wait to see the next. The only thing left to do is heart transplant, and some of my numbers indicate I should be on the list, and then there's the fact that I just function really well. So
Yeah,
we're
well,
dealing with it.
the good thing is that your overall the other aspects of you are very healthy, right? Is
Yeah.
one part that's not. So the other parts of Lorianne are working overtime to be able to support the heart. And the part of like you've got the biggest heart I've ever met. You know, I'm gonna say like bless your heart type of southern. That's not in a figuratively speaking. What you it's great if there's somebody tells you you have the biggest heart you've ever met if it's figuratively, not when it's literal.
Right.
Right? You're like, that's not the type of thing I want to hear
Uh,
from a doctor, from a friend that's saying I've got a great big heart of kindness.
and I
But
didn't even know a big heart was a thing,
yeah,
other than what you're talking about. I thought
yeah.
I didn't even know your heart could get big. So
Yeah, so that's yeah, not what you wanted to hear. But how awesome that then it's your doctor, your cardiologist that then wrote the forward of your book of the Divine Detour. The the parts that you mentioned before, you were saying about experiencing one of the stages of life. And it's something I talk in my podcast a lot about regarding the book, the stages of grief, sorry. The stages of grief. The it was written particularly in the stages that somebody facing death goes through. And so you mentioned denial was one of those in your case. Were there others that you saw show up? Now you're definitely like in the acceptance stage, 9 years in, you're like this is my life living with this chronic
Mhm.
disease. What other of these stages of being faced with death did you face?
I mean, I think it took me several years to kind of get down into acceptance where this is just part of who we are. And when I say we, I mean it affected not just me, it affected my husband, it affected my children, it affected everybody in my family. And we sort of had to come to that acceptance as a unit. Like this is I'm not the mom that I wanted to be. I'm not, I became a grandma a couple years ago, and even though they never thought I would see that day, I'm not the grandma that I wanted to be, that I hope to be. But
And that's a whole other grief aspect as well there
yeah,
too, because then it's a life not looking like you thought it was going to look like.
exactly. Yes, and I one of the things that I have identified a lot with is there's this thing called illness identity where you and it's a lot like the stages of grief, but you can get to almost past that acceptance where you can say, not only do I know that my illness is part of who I am, but now I can use it to make positive changes in my life. And so that is where I think I'm trying to get. And I think I'm making strides in that way because you really have to get, I feel like in my case, I had to get to where I was comfortable and stop fighting. I was still, researching on the internet and asking all my doctor friends. And finally, one of my doctor friends said, the heart is the only muscle that can't heal itself. It doesn't regenerate new muscle tissue. And so once you lose that, it's gone. And just to hear that from a doctor that was my friend, I knew I'm going to have to revamp what I'm thinking. And so that started the process of me really wrapping my arms around this thing. And and I've tried to take that as a springboard to let's take that and look at that as a gift because I get to know that this is important time and that I need to make hay with it. So that's what I've tried to do, is kind of get into that enrichment stage.
And it's so true. Like what you're just saying is like you okay, these are the cards I got dealt. Now what now? What now? And how with this life experience that I have, how do I pay it forward? And service, I feel, is such a huge part of a grief journey, of a mourning process of when we're going through these hard emotions. When we serve others and we're in service of others, it also helps us in that process. Now, you started blogging as part of your therapy, quote unquote, and processing your emotions. Talk about that journey. And did you write, were you a writer before? I mean, you mentioned you're a professor. So were you a writer before?
Yes. I was not. To be fully, to full disclosure, is I have a master's degree in tax and I am a CPA. And I knew as soon as I started into my career as a CPA in a national tax firm, I'm like, this isn't for me. But I'd already gone to school for so many years. So I switched over to teaching, and that sort of engaged that part of my brain a little bit more. But I still felt like there was something more. And I didn't know what that was going to be. And so at that time that I was diagnosed, I thought, I'm going to kind of explore what that next part might be. And as it turns out, once I got my diagnosis and whatever happened to me that Thanksgiving week that really took me down a level, put me at a position where I couldn't stand up and lecture anymore. And I had to make a change whether I wanted to or not. And that's when I started writing. And mostly it was for me. A little bit of it was to keep people updated on what was going on with my health. But when I hit that time where nothing was changing for a year and a half, I didn't have I didn't have anything to write about on my health. So I started looking at these questions that were just nagging at me. And that's when I sort of embraced this idea of maybe, the book's called Divine Detour. And, detour is just when you have a plan and you're on your road and you've figured out the quickest, most efficient, smoothest route. And then for some reason, you get shoved off on this little dirt road that you don't want to be on. And it's windy and it's out of the way and it's inconvenient and the stops aren't great. And I was on that detour, and other people were saying, I don't have a health issue and I don't have anything going on medically with myself, especially not heart failure. But what you're saying resonates with me because I'm going through a divorce or I just lost my job and I never expected to be here. And so those were the kind of things where I said, okay, this detour idea is something that's bigger than just my little medical story. And so that's when I really started to embrace that idea of writing about people just facing things that maybe they planned all their life to never face, and then they do.
As you're saying the word detour, and you mentioned in a really beautiful way, like what it means in life. I have a little anecdote of that word detour, if I'm going to share it with you, but it's a completely different way. But this little kid, worked with kids, and this kid comes in, it's like, so we were late. We had to take a detour. And I was like, well, what's a detour? Well, the road was closed, so we had to take a different road. But it was so cute that the way, like, he was like 3, right? The fact that the mom just said, "Well, it's closed. We gotta take another road." And that is life. Sometimes it is closed and we take a different road. And you really had planned your life around getting to that destination, go, at a certain time, how long it takes to get there, and it isn't that way, and you do
Yeah.
have to take these detours and really not know what is going to be there. But the part of your book that is even just added is that then it just says the path you'd never choose can lead to the faith you've always wanted. So let's talk then about that aspect of faith and how that really played a role in your journey of accepting this major detour in your life.
Yes. I had I've always grown up in a Christian home, and we raised our kids in a Christian home, but when I got that diagnosis, things just I felt like I was going to break that faith. I felt like this is not a situation that's going to end well. And so if I get that down and use it, I'm going to break it and not be able to pass that heirloom down. And so I kind of stepped away from it, and I thought, I'm going to wait until things look like they're going to turn out. And that was a really dangerous place to be, because when you have that belief system and the time that you need it the most, when you stop using it, then you run the risk of never returning to it at all. So I just started to say, I've got too much history. I have too much invested. I'm going to ask all those hard questions. And the questions I looked at in the book are just big life questions. And the three that the book's formatted around are: is this life all there is? And then I looked at, is God always good? Because what I'm going through doesn't feel so good. And then, is God's plan enough? Because I'm fighting against what seems like this plan that's pulling me into it. And I don't want to be in it. I want to do everything I can to stay out of it. So I looked at those questions from all different angles. And, I guess the spoiler alert for the book is that I didn't answer the questions. I just gave people permission to ask them. And I think that's what made my faith stronger, and for sure kept me from walking away from it, because I flung that door open and I said, I'm asking, I'm going to go there. And when I did that, this conversation started with God, that I was able to really feel like I wasn't alone in that situation that I was in. And so I think that was key of everything I learned, was that there's more value sometimes in your questions than there are in the answers that you think are out there.
We're back to that part of questions. We talked about it in the doctor component of asking the right questions. And here it's the same thing, the questions, and just trying to figure out, am I even going to know this answer? Probably not. It's kind of like when we tell kids as parents, don't do something, and they want the answer. And sometimes we really cannot give them the answer. They're not really at a maturity level to really even understand the answer, and they just have to go by the faith and the love that they have to us as our kids, and follow along in that. We say, yeah, I'm sorry, you cannot go tonight, or whatever it is, right? And that's kind of how we are in this life. A lot of it, for those of us that do believe that there's something greater than us, that we just have that faith that some of these answers are not going to be questions, sorry, are not going to be answered right now. And it's okay. And it's okay. And it's just part of it. And like you said, it's like it's not always going to look pretty, or like as if it's coming from a loving space. Like a timeout does that for a kid doesn't seem like it's loving, but for a parent, they are doing it in a, in a loving way sometimes when they give a child a timeout, right? So there are these tests that we're given, and we have to sometimes just have that trust that there is something that we may not again ever know in this life what it was for.
Yes. That's so true. I love that idea, because I think as human beings, we're just not ready. We're not in a position to understand closed doors. I mean, we see doors close and we think it was opened for them, or it was opened for me last time. But some of us that have lived longer can go, "Oh, now I can look back on a closed door and realize that," or on an open door, I can walk through an open door and realize, oh, all those other doors had to be shut in order for me to walk through this one. But we don't see that. And so that's where a faith is tested, where we get a no answer, or we get a bad diagnosis, or we get a closed door. What am I going to do with that? And you, as a child, you have to trust your parents, like you said, and so much more do we have to trust, God, to say, oh, I've got you, because he rarely explains in our lifetime a closed door. And so we just have to have that. Sometimes we get a glimpse of it, but some we may not even in our lifetime get a glimpse of why that door was closed.
Yeah, and that's those what do they call them? The silver lining that a lot of times people are like, well, at least XYZ, right? And those at least when someone's grieving are not the best. They're not very supportive. Sometimes you feel of them as if they're kind of taking away from your pain, like yeah, not taking the weight out of the situation that you're feeling and the value of that. But when we're saying here, what we're talking about here is just a little further. It's not that we're saying that you have gone through something and then something beautiful came from it and that you actually see it. Like you said, you may see little glimpses of it, you may not. And it is okay to not see it. And it's also okay, like you mentioned it in the beginning, to doubt your faith and to go through that moment of doubt. But the reality is, if you're going to be living with a chronic illness like you're living yourself, you have a choice of how you want to live it. And do you
Mhm.
prefer to live it in anger, in, I don't know, what other emotions, and just this uh,
Yeah.
you know, being upset at what happened? Or do you want to shift it and be like, okay, this is what is, and there might be a reason of why it is occurring, and I'm going to choose to live it thinking there's a reason, whether I find out the reason or not, right?
Yeah.
And it just shifts your energy as you're living life. Would you find that to be true,
Yes.
like for you?
Yes. I do so much, and I think one of the things that, I've often thought of is that I was so focused on being healed, permanently healed, and having my heart restored to where it was and having my life back. And I was just waiting for that miracle that I had envisioned for myself. And I didn't realize that whole time that I was living in it. I was living in the miracle, and that there were these little tiny flecks of glitter swirling all around me. But I was so focused on something outside of it, I couldn't see that dazzling thing going on. The fact that I'm still alive 9 years later, they kind of sent me home with they did send me home with a hospice binder that first ICU stay. And they were thinking 6 months. And I held on, and I got to see my daughter graduate from high school and my son graduate. I got to see my daughter get married. I got to see my grandchild born and then turn one and then turn two. And none of that was expected. And if I was still focused on, oh, but I'm not healed. Oh, but I swore I'd never get this device implanted. I'm like, I'm not doing it. I'm going to get better. But if I didn't get it, I probably wouldn't be here. And so sometimes we have to reform that. And my mom used to say, sometimes you have to act better than you feel. And that sometimes is the first step in saying, I don't feel that great, but I'm going to look for those little tiny flecks of glitter that are swirling around my life right now. And someday they're all going to settle into this beautiful mosaic that I don't know what it's going to look like, but someday they're going to make it. And right now, I'm just living in it. And so I just need to be acting better than I feel.
When you said that part, like I was living in the miracle, like I literally got goosebumps. We are. Every one of us is. Every day it is that way. And it just changes the whole way in how we view our life.
It does.
It just
It
changes it.
does.
Like, oh God, I really did get little goosebumps. I wanted to read a part of your Divine Detour clip. Is that okay?
Yes.
Book. So this was the part of the questions, and then I want to go into the part of the grief mixed with gratitude component. But I still struggle with questions almost daily, but rather than seeing them as a threat to my faith, I see them as a lifeline to keep it. The post diagnosis years have taken me on a faith detour I never saw coming. And this is the part of what you were saying. As a longtime believer, I felt profoundly disappointed. I wanted answers, but more importantly, I needed permission to ask the questions. And then you talk about what the book then is about, which is a 40-day book. And this is what you said about asking then questions. You're also then allowing others around you to have permission to ask those questions as well. So take us into how Divine Detour is structured into these 40 days. And you mentioned the reasoning behind it being, biblical. So take us in how it's structured and how someone can kind of
Yeah.
navigate through the book in their journey.
Yeah. So when I put the book together, it's arranged around those three big questions that I mentioned earlier. And the at first I felt like they didn't go together. I felt like all the thoughts I was having really didn't have a structure. But when I started looking at them in terms of those three questions, it came about from Jesus's temptation in the desert and what he faced in those three temptations. And there was a lot of similarity in what he was going through and what I was going through. His was certainly a detour. Mine felt like a desert detour as well. And they started, all my thoughts and writing started to go into these three categories. And I, it was another sort of added bonus, I think, is I realized that for myself, and I think for most people that are in a grief experience, you have a shortened attention span and you just need a nugget to hold on. And sometimes all you can do is have this little attention span and little bit of time and a little bit of tolerance for some input. And so I wrote it in terms of 40 short essays, and they're all standalone essays. And so you can look at either the main question, there's 13 essays under each main question, or you can just look at the title. Like that first one you mentioned was grief and gratitude, and just pick one. And where do I feel today that would speak to me on my journey?
Mm.
And so it's not something that you go through necessarily chronologically, or because I don't think any of us process grief or life chronologically most of the time. So we we can just jump in, and it's just a nugget of something that people can look at and think about and ponder and reread if they need to. And so that was something that was exciting for me. And then recently, I was able to record the audiobook for it, and
Oh,
my
wonderful.
publisher made that available. So, because sometimes I know when, when you're really hurting, even reading is hard, but I found that I can listen sometimes easier than I can read.
Yeah, I love listening to audiobooks when I'm walking my dogs or
Yeah.
that's usually what I do. So I'm doing two different things that are healing or in my process, right? The
Yes.
walking, being in nature, actually more than one, moving, being in nature, plus also reading, quote unquote. Now, I wanted to read a little part of that part of grief and gratitude. So, grief and gratitude are not an either or proposition. We can be grateful and still be grieving, which is the whole reason that I have the name of my podcast. So, talk about those perspectives of the gratitude and grief in your own life.
Yes. So, first of all, I thought it was amazing that your podcast was so similar to that first essay that was in my book. And that one was ended up to be the first essay because that was kind of the cornerstone of how I started to process this whole book. And when I realized that, I think so many times we get focused on one thing and we're trained to just be, okay, I'm grieving right now, or I'm being grateful, or I'm being happy, or I'm being, I miss you,
Yeah,
or I,
compartmentalizing our emotions.
yes,
Yeah.
yes, just we're in this. And when I realized, and I think it was Francis Weller that said, it's a mature person who can hold grief in one hand and gratitude in the other and then be stretched large by them, which made so much sense to me because I found that the things that I was grieving the most were the things that I was most grateful for. Those were my pain points. And I thought, that's it. The things that it's both ends of this realization that you have that I've been given something of great value and it's very important to me. And there's the part where you receive that, and then there's the part where you release that, whether it's through death or circumstances. But both of them are this realization that I had something of such value and they meant so much to me. And they go together because we can't really be grateful, I think, unless we've lost something important to us. And when we're in that grief situation, what keeps us from bottoming out is the fact that we're grateful. So they work so well together. And I just wanted them to be, worst enemies. I wanted them to be opposite ends of the spectrum. But really, they help us realize these things that are transient in our lives and that were just given to us through grace. They're just
Mm.
things that were gifts. And one's on their way in and one's on their way out.
Yeah, they don't it's again not to minimize the grief experience. When you're grateful is not taking away from the part that you're
Yes.
grieving. It's just really just an it's kind of this supporting your grief
Yeah.
in that gratitude practice as well. And again, they go hand in hand. Now, what are some tips, let's say, if someone right now is facing a a really tough situation in their life and they're standing in this door that is closing. What are some tips that you would say, or what would you say to someone that's in this moment right now of this crossroad in their life?
One of the things that I realized at some point in those early days was that I was at a loss for any better way to say it. I was at a loss for words and I didn't know what I was feeling because I didn't have words to put to them. And I realized that I don't have to have words. I can borrow words. And that's where it's so helpful to have podcasts like this, where you can borrow words from other people and, books where you can read and see and borrow their thoughts. Maybe they're further on down the line from where you are. And even, sometimes I would, my instinct told me to go to scripture, but sometimes it felt too rich for me. It felt it was too soon almost for me to go there. And so I needed to read trusted people that wrote about such things that I knew their lives and I trusted their thoughts. And then a strange one for me maybe was that even when I didn't have the mental capacity to read or the emotional whatever it took to read, I would listen to Christian music or, any type of lyrics that would sink in because those were what I would cling to. And sometimes, songwriters can put words together, they can string words together that are like magical. And those can resonate in your head and help you get to that next level and just kind of like a little tether that you're desperate, you're holding on by your fingertips, but those words are this tether to hang on.
So perfect. Now, in that part, in that same question, how can someone, or how even for yourself, how can the circle of friends of someone that's going through something like this show that support? And how did you feel that support from your circle? What were some
Mm,
of the things people did? Again, it was not what they said, probably. That was the, oh,
yeah.
what were some of the ways that you felt with the support?
Yeah. I think the thing that and people we know this is what's so hard is we know this, but it's not in our DNA to do it, is to just be there. Just show up and just don't say anything, unless unless they ask you. But don't give advice. Don't, you know, it always lands flat. But it's so hard to just be there for some reason. And I think that was what really helped us through that, was just having people say, "Ugh, this is horrible. I don't know what this feels like. I don't know what you're going through, but we're here. We're here. We're just going to sit here and be quiet." And for some reason, I, my personality wants to do something. It's like, can I bake you a cake? What can I do? And sometimes nothing is the best thing you can do, which is sometimes also the hardest thing to do. And then I think the other thing I would say is that, chronic illness is a lot like the grief process when you lose a loved one. I had I'm 9 years into this. I had a lady come up to me who'd been praying for me, and sweetest lady, but came up to me about 2 years into my diagnosis, and she said, "Whew, I'm glad that's over." And my husband and I still laugh about that because they want it to be over so much. Let's tie a bow on it and go on. And we want to do that with grief too. We want to say, "Oh, I lost both my parents in 2020, and it still feels like I just lost them." And we just want to go, "Well, that's done. Now let's go on to the next thing." And so just be really open to that window and give them that, you know, it takes a long time. You're never going to be the same. And so asking, how they're doing, even long after, sometimes people think, I don't want to bring up the person, that's gone, or I don't want to remind you that you have this disease, so I'm not going to ask you about it. But we want you to ask about it because that means that you care, that you remember. And that's the biggest part.
Yeah, they usually say that a lot of times people show up a lot that first week of someone going through something, and then afterwards it dissipates as if it's just done. We have a society in general that we are comfort seeking beings, and anything that just throws us off of that comfort zone and puts us with discomfort, which illness does, death does, just doesn't sit well with us. We want to fix it, and so and if we don't know how to fix it, then we try to avoid it. And that's when a lot of times people then may not show up and ask you anymore if you want to go out to lunch. And, or in your case, like maybe some of your friends, like that are still kind of not knowing what to do with the idea of you at one point not being here
Mhm.
anymore, know what to do with that. And they may prefer to separate themselves from
Yeah.
you. Did you notice any rifts like that
Yeah.
in your life?
I for sure did. And they it's hard because it's not something they're familiar with, but I have to be really careful about what I eat, and because I don't handle sodium really well. And that was one of my problems early on, is I didn't know that I was carrying around 14 pounds of fluid because of sodium. And so I have to avoid that, which everything has sodium, especially if you're eating out. If it's good, it has sodium, a lot of sodium in it. So I noticed people just stop asking. It's just too hard. It's too hard to have my husband and I over for dinner. It's too hard to meet at a restaurant. We don't know where. Let's just not do that. And that that's just another part of something that you lose, that you're like, well, and I think the better thing would be to just hit it head on and say, let's figure this out. And I had one friend who was like that, and she actually had liver cancer. So she understood the dietary restrictions, and she understood the weird awkwardness with people. And I got a bad heart checkup, and she just drove over to my house. She was quite a bit older than I was, but she used to cut my hair, and then we just became these really good friends. She drove over to my house, and she said, "Let's go find something we can eat." And we found something. We sat in her truck and we ate it, and she said, what do you want out of life? And I thought, has anyone ever asked me that question? And I was like, wow, I'm just going to tell you. And it was so freeing because I knew she was dealing with that same question. And so part of what was so appealing about her was she wasn't afraid. She wasn't afraid to say those things and ask those questions. And I think back to the question thing, sometimes when we get in an awkward situation, we're like, I don't want to ask the wrong question. But I think even if you ask a question that feels like, well, that was a dumb question, it shows that you care about them. It shows that you want to know. It shows that you want to be part of their lives. And so I say all this about questions because I was terrible about asking questions in my earlier life. I thought I have to know the answer before I ask the question or I'm not asking it, you know? So that's been just a huge theme in both my faith and my health and my relationships and everything.
I love that question that your friend did. And I actually had that as a question that I wanted to ask was how do you see your life just unfolding from here on? Like what are your hopes and your dreams from
Yeah.
it's been 9 years. What are some of these hopes and dreams that you have for yourself and your family?
Yeah. I, so many of them I've kind of tried to retrain myself to be watching for, but I just want to keep doing what I'm doing with my family. And like right now, I am moving my daughter into her new apartment in St. Louis, and I'm in her apartment. That's why it looks so cute. Um, but I just want to keep being part of that in whatever capacity. And I know that's going to change because I'm not going to be able to do, um, all the things that even now, I'm not doing all the things I would like to do to help her move in. But I want to be able to just find new ways to do the things I want to do. Just from a strictly health point, they've kind of done everything for me that they can do at this point. I'm on the highest dosage of all the medications I can handle, and I have the newest device. And the next step would be transplant. And so from that perspective, I would hope that if I need to get that, that I would get on the list while I'm healthy enough and be able to recover from that and get some more years out of that. And so um, we're taking it one little bit at a time and appreciating every little part of it as it comes and realizing, and I think we all realize this with our as our kids grow up anyway, but every part we don't get to see it all. We just see this one little window and we step into that window and we live it and we appreciate it and then we go to the next one.
And as we're speaking here with the windows around you, I know people are just listening, but yes, just live in that little space and in that moment. It's just perfect. So beautiful. Lorianne, now as we wrap up, is there something I have not asked you? And we will make sure before this final question, we will also end with how people can find you. But what is something you'd like to say that I may not have asked?
Mm. I think, uh, you know, and we've said this throughout the interview about just grasping those questions as a point of strength. I would just challenge people to, if you're like me and somebody that, and I don't know if it was my education or the generation I'm in or whatever it was, but to see those questions as something that opens up conversation, that strengthens where you're at, and they don't always have to be answered. You don't have to have a final bookend on it. Because I think that was kind of an aha for me was like the question, if it comes, it has to have an answer. And it really doesn't. It can hang there and it can grow relationships. It can open up hearts. It can just make conversations happen and never be answered. And that's okay. But I had to take a long time to get to that point.
So just basically being present in the journey and not being so focused on that destination is the way of like ask the questions and getting the answer. It's kind of as if you just get to the destination type of thing. No, just ask the questions,
Yes.
and that's the road you're on. That's your journey. Thank you so much again, Lorianne. And to get a hold of you, people can visit your website, loriannewood.com. Yes. And
Yes.
share the different offerings that you have there, your books, your blogs, and how they can get more. We just heard about the Audible and other things that people can get from you, please.
Yes. So at my website, there's a loriannewood.com/books, and you can learn more about the book. You can read the first chapter. You can see a book trailer, and there's links to buy that. And also, if anyone would be interested on this idea of gratitude, I have a 3-day Devo reading where it's just for 3 days, back to short attention span, but 3 days. And it's called Cultivating Gratitude When Life is Hard. And you can get that at loriannewood.com/gratitude devo. And then there, I have some gratitude tips that are really just, I guess, just really practical things like, well, I'm going to be grateful while I'm brushing my teeth because I know I brush my teeth every day. So I'm going to be grateful then. So I have some tips about how do I incorporate gratitude in my life without adding one more thing to my to-do list. And that's those tips you can get at loriannewood.com/gratitude tips. So I would love to do that. I'd also love to connect on Facebook and Instagram. I'm Lorianne Wood on both of those places.
Perfect. Now I know what I'm going to be thinking of every time I brush my teeth. Because, yeah, sometimes you're like, wait, I don't have a journal next to my bed and this one more thing I have to write. So just thinking of something you're grateful, not just one, maybe you start with one, two, three, maybe then by that time you've been brushing your teeth for 30 minutes because you thought of so many things you were grateful for.
That's right.
Thank you once again. It was a pleasure having you on the podcast, and you have a beautiful energy and a huge heart in the figurative way as well.
Thank you. It's so
Okay.
great to be here.
Thank you. Thank you again so much for choosing to listen today. I hope that you can take away a few nuggets from today's episode that can bring you comfort in your times of grief. If so, it would mean so much to me if you would rate and comment on this episode. And if you feel inspired in some way to share it with someone who may need to hear this, please do so. Also, if you or someone you know has a story of grief and gratitude that should be shared so that others can be inspired as well, please reach out to me. And thanks once again for tuning in to Grief, Gratitude, and the Gray in Between podcast. Have a beautiful day.